song. So last week we looked at the Israelites as they continued their journey toward the Promised Land. They continued their journey. They were going through some of the lands, and some of the kings of the lands that were trying to journey through would not let them pass through. And so as they were not allowed to pass through, the kings came up with their swords, and the Israelites ended up basically taking over the lands. We saw the Israelites taking over several of the lands that were not the lands that were promised, but as they were going through, traveling toward the Promised Land, that was just part of their way to get there. And so what we looked at last week was they were getting closer to Moab, and the king of Moab, Balak, was scared of the Israelites. He knew that that Moab could not face the Israelites. He had seen what the Israelites had done to all the countries surrounding him, and knew that they could not defeat them in battle. And so he called on a soothsayer, somebody who could talk to God, Balaam. And so we looked last week at how Balaam came to Balak, and Balak wanted Balaam to intercede. Balak wanted Balaam to go to God, and he wanted Balaam to come to the Israelites and curse them, basically, so that the Moabites could defeat the Israelites. We talked about Balaam not being able to do that. Balaam basically told Balak that he could only do what God told him to do. So Balaam failed to pronounce these curses on Israel. So we also talked about Balaam's flaw, his major flaw last week. Really, the root of his sin was in his heart, not really in what he did as much, because he could only do what God said. And so what we looked at last week, we talked about this week's lesson a little bit. So as I was preparing for this week, of course, a little bit you see in the book, and then some of the stuff I was studying about this passage in particular, talked about Balaam, even though Balaam's not mentioned in Numbers chapter 25. When you're studying Numbers chapter 25, really Balaam is at the heart of it. He's at the root of it. And so one of the interesting commentaries I read talked about Balaam's ride home after he came in and thought that he would eventually talk God into cursing the Israelites. It's probably a very disappointing ride home, thinking he had failed. Makes you wonder if he tried to engage the donkey again, tried to talk to the donkey again, see if it would talk back to him, right? Then all of a sudden he probably came up with this idea, because Balaam knew God's way. He knew that God wouldn't curse Israel, but he also knew that God would only bless Israel if God's blessing on Israel were conditional. He would only bless Israel if Israel followed his commands. And so it was impossible to persuade God to forsake his purpose of blessing Israel. But history has proven that it's probably going to be pretty easy to persuade the Israelites to turn away from God and pull them away from God, as they had time and time again. And so probably on the way back, I don't know that we see in the Bible when Balaam devised his plan to go back to Balak. But at some point, Balaam devised this plan and shared it with Balak on how to defeat the Israelites, so that he could receive, whether it was the wages that he wanted, whether it was the praise that he wanted from Balak. He devised this plan. And so the seduction of the Israelites that we're going to read about today, and the death of over 24,000 of God's chosen people, at its roots is the result of one man's counsel, of Balaam's counsel, to Balak, the king of the Moabites. I just wanted to point that out, that before we go into the lesson today, that it is tied into last week's lesson. We're not going to read anything about Balaam today. We're not going to talk any more about it. I did want to kind of tie that in before we go into it. That Balaam really led into what we're talking about today. So we'll go into the scripture for today, Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 through 15. Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you killed his men who were joined to Baal of Peor. And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and then the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel with my zeal. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him, a covenant of everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made an atonement for the children of Israel. Now the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, the leader of a father's house among the Simeonites. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zer. He was the head of the people of a father's house in Midian. So at this point in Numbers, what we're looking at, the Israelites were camped out in the Acacia Grove. They were on the east side of the Jordan River. And they were waiting for God to lead them into the promised land. So that's where they've been. They've been through their ups and downs. They've been wandering through the desert for almost 40 years at this point. And they're just east of the Jordan River waiting on God to deliver them into the promised land. They're unaware of the plots against them at this point of the Moabites and the Midianites, what they're trying to plot against them. They don't know what's going on. From all they saw, if they even saw it, Balaam just came to bless them as God's people. They didn't see the plots behind it. They didn't see what Balaam was doing. They just saw Balaam, if they even saw it, come to bless them and call out God's blessings on them as God's chosen people. And then all of a sudden, the women of Moab start coming out. I don't know if they came out to the camps. I don't know if we see exactly what happened. But coming out to the men of Israel to seduce them. Once this has been going on for a little while, the Israelite men are starting to be invited back to dinner with these people to eat food that they probably haven't eaten in a long time. You got to remember, these people have been traveling through the desert. They've been eating nothing but manna and occasionally quail. So they're probably being invited to partake in food that they haven't partaken in a long time. And then as a part of that, in addition to that, they're kind of being persuaded, oh, by the way, we also do these things as part of this. And they're being persuaded to partake in sacrifices to idols and worshiping these Moabite and Midianite gods. So the question that we have to ask is, at what point do you think these men should have become suspicious? Oh, by the way, the other thing that we learn in Deuteronomy 23, kind of later in the Bible, that happened before this, is that the Moabites refused to give the Israelites food and water as they were coming out of Egypt. So this is a people that, as they were coming out of Egypt, the Moabites refused to give them food and water. And all of a sudden, these women are coming out, and they're trying to bring them into their camp, and they're just trying to be all buddy-buddy with them. At what point do you think these men should have been suspicious? And all of a sudden, they're inviting them over for steak dinners and whatever else, just being all buddy-buddy with them. So let's look now at the sin. The title of the lesson today is Israel's sin in Moab. So what was Israel's sin? What was the actual sin that it's talking about? Was there one or was there more than one? Worldly ways? The big one was idolatry. Yeah, so that is the big one. The first one that we look at, though, we see in the very first verse, is the sexual sin. So we see in the very first verse, it's talking about men engaging in sexual activity with prostitutes. That the women of Moab, they sent basically their prostitutes out to come entice them in. That's how they first got them into their country, first got them in to have those first conversations and relate to the people. The second one is spiritual harlotry, if you will. Basically cheating on God by worshiping these other gods, idolatry. So which is the one God was most concerned with? I think John said it, the idolatry. The one that God was most concerned with was the fact that they were going and worshiping these other gods. Not that he wasn't concerned with the sexual sin of it. God was still concerned with that part of it. But the big sin that they had was where they were turning their back on God. As they were going to eat with these people and converse with these people, they were also worshiping their gods. And so this sin of idolatry, what we see in this passage is, appears to divide the Israelites. Now, we don't know anything about that as a country today, do we? About something dividing a nation? I think so. So there's a large part of the Israelites who are fully engaged in this sin. They're fully engaged in the Midianite and Moab peoples. They're having sexual relationships with them. They're worshiping their false gods. And then there's a large group of the Israelites that basically just hang back at the camp. They mourn because of the sin of their fellow Israelites. So one day, what we read in the passage, one day at the tent of the meeting, they're all sitting around, they're mourning, and one of the Israelite men brings a Midianite woman back into the camp in front of the whole congregation and in front of Moses, not just the congregation. Moses is there too, their leader. And the words the Bible says is, he presented her to them. So it's not like he just paraded her in front of them and didn't say anything. He says he presented her to them. So it's almost like he said, here, I'm bringing her as my girlfriend, my wife, whatever. He presented her to them. So he actually introduced her to the entire congregation of Israelites that were sitting there mourning because of the sin that the people were facing. So after this, what we see is Phinehas. He gets up and goes to the tent and runs the javelin through them. But Phinehas knows he doesn't need further direction from God. Phinehas knows that he doesn't need some special revelation. Thousands of Israelites at this point, God's people, had died from the plague because of this sin that this particular Israelite has now come blatantly flaunted in front of his fellow men. I don't know that we know the details of the plague. Does anybody know if we know the details of what this plague was? From anywhere else in Scripture. I know we don't see it here. I don't think we know the details of what the plague was, but it killed roughly 20,000 Israelites. So there are a few things I do want to make sure that we're very clear about in this discussion when we talk about this Israelite bringing a Midianite woman back to the camp, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So the first thing is it had nothing to do with race. It wasn't because she was a Midianite woman. So how do we know that? How do we know that God wasn't going to be angry about an Israelite intermarrying with somebody else that wasn't an Israelite? What are some of the things that we can look at to know that? Moses married a Midianite. So Moses is the prime example. Yeah, Moses also married an Ethiopian. So one of our, I think it was our third lesson in Numbers, we looked at Moses marrying an Ethiopian woman. And the lesson we looked at was Moses' sister Miriam actually tried to bring that against Moses and bring that up as something that Moses shouldn't have done. He should have married this woman who was not an Israelite. How did that turn out for her when she looked at that? Not too well. She got leprosy for about a week, right? She was kicked out of camp with leprosy. God told her, you probably don't want to bring something against Moses as the leader of your people. So it had nothing to do with race. It wasn't the fact that she was a Midianite woman that God didn't like that. Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say probably the reason they made reference to this Midianite woman was because it says in the right he did this with this Midianite woman right in front of the eyes of Moses, who had married a Midianite woman. So it was almost like it was in the face of Moses and everything, like, yeah, okay, you did. And then this guy steps up and takes care of the situation right there in front of Moses and everybody else. Doesn't say Moses even solved the problem. It says somebody else did. So it may have been, Moses may have been a little bit reluctant or something, I don't know.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that part of it? So the second point is it had very little, if anything, to do with the sexual sin. So the whole ordeal started out with harlotry, with prostitution. But what it turned into was an intermingling of Israelite men and possibly women with the Midianite and Moabite women, the Midianite people, not prostitutes. The one that we saw here, this Israelite man that brought this Midianite woman back to the camp, both of them were children of leaders of their respective tribes. And so it wasn't like he brought a prostitute back in front of the Israelites and said, here, look what I've got. It was a woman from another tribe who probably was a distinguished woman. And so it wasn't like he went and just found a prostitute. It wasn't about the sexual sin part of it. Now, I'm not saying that God wasn't mad about the participation in sexual sin. I want to make sure y'all don't leave here thinking that. I'm just pointing out this was a time when, even if this man already had a wife, this was a time when God still allowed multiple wives. And so it wasn't the sexual sin, I don't think, that God was mad about. The big thing that God was mad about was the idolatry. The fact that these people were marrying into a nation where they were then going back, worshiping their gods, participating in sacrifices to these false gods.
And that God had warned them that this would happen if they intermarried with the nations around them. He had told them honestly because of this.
I think the timing was bad too on that Israelites' part, because he came in when they were all weeping. That's what it said, they were all weeping and trying to, they were being, the ones that were weeping were more so what was going on, and they wanted all the places to stop, and they were the ones, if I'm understanding it right, they were the ones that had not turned their back at that point. And so he's coming in that time, and it almost seems like he wasn't part of the remorseful side and the repentant side of the Israelites. He was off doing his own thing to care less what they were doing. It was almost like a slap in the face. Yeah, yeah.
Well, the Revelation makes it very clear that Balaam, when he taught this, got convinced the people that the only way to get him is to bring them down. Basically, what he was saying is, get them to suck them in to join you and become a part of you, become a part of your culture, your things, do those things, and as you suck them in, and that's kind of how it starts in 25, starts by seducing them, bringing them in. Next thing you know, they're taking up not just their idolatry, their sexual ways, the adultery, everything that they're into, the idolatry and everything, pulled into where this woman now is just a flagrant thing that's just having an affair, if you will, just bring a woman in and have, and it seemed to be okay. And that's what Revelation basically was accusing the church of, being just like them, by accepting the ways of the world around them and just trying to merge in and make it all okay and still be a part of God. And they said in Revelation that absolutely was not okay, and the illustration goes right back to here, that just because the rest of the world says it's okay doesn't mean it is. And that's how the world, Satan does, is he pulls us away by slowly moving us into compromise with the views of the world around, and next thing you know, you're worshiping some other god.
Was this before God gave them the order not to intermarry? Deuteronomy 7:3.
It was before.
No,
It was not before.
Moses married the Midianite was before that, before the law had been given. But the law had been given at the start of this 40 years.
So the next part is God's reaction. What was God's reaction to the sin? What did God tell Moses to have done? kill all the leaders. So the first part, though, was the plague, right? We don't really see much about it other than the plague ended. We don't see the beginning of the plague. We don't know when it started. So God's first reaction was there is a plague on people. So up to 20,000 of them died. But the second part, kill the leaders. Why the leaders? Why just the leaders? That was really the thing God had to end it.
Because they let him know.
So
So the rest of you were following you.
Either let them or condone it, one or the other.
yeah, they either let them or condone it, one or the other. So we talked just a minute ago, the ones that Phineas ended up killing were both children of leaders of both tribes. So the man was an Israelite, and so his father was a leader of the Israelites. And so his father, whether he condoned it or whether he just let it happen, obviously wasn't standing up and telling his son, no, you can't do this. So he was letting his son go off and worship these idols and bring this Midianite woman back into the Israelite camp. And he just let it go on. So Phineas took it into his own hands. This is one of the stories, I think, where we often look at the Old Testament and you look at something like God saying, just take all the leaders and take them out in the daylight, hang them, kill them. And we look at it as the wrath of God. You know, the God of the Old Testament is being so different from the God of the New Testament. But it's also one that I see, you know, if you look at it, it's really the story of a loving God. If you look at what these people were doing, if you really look at it, what they're doing is turning their back on God. And there are so many of them that are just going and worshiping other gods. They're completely going against this God that was delivering them from Egypt and taking them to a land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land. And they're just completely turning their back on him. And so what God's doing here, it is gruesome. It is exactly what we're reading. It's taking the leaders out and hanging them out in the streets. But it's better than the alternative of continuing the plague that would have killed all of the Israelites that sinned. It's the leaders are the ones that led them astray, like we said, whether they condoned it, whether they just let it happen. Rather than punishing everybody that sinned, God chose to just punish the leaders.
You can send a message, no matter who you are, you got to tell them.
So God showed his love and mercy, I think, on his people, just by holding the leaders accountable and not holding everybody that's sinned accountable. So the takeaway for this message, and I really just have one big one, and for me it's kind of a wrap up of the Israelites. We looked at their journey. We've got one more week next week. So as you look at the journey of the Israelites and see the consistent back and forth, the consistent ups and downs of the Israelites, one of the things that I occasionally will struggle with in my own life is, as you go to God in prayer every day, one of the things you always ask for is, Lord, forgive me my sin. So one of my struggles is, why is it that we have to do that every single day? Like if you're a Christian, you're trying your best to follow God, why do you have to ask for forgiveness every single day? What is it about it that we still fall short every day? And so if you look at the Israelites, I think the example from the Israelites, and you talk about what was it that really made God angry at the Israelites? What were the things that really stick out throughout Exodus and Numbers about the Israelites that really made God mad? It's their disobedience. It's when they turn their back on God. It's when they worship other gods. They just completely turn their back on God. They turn away from God. They put other things before God. It's not just a sin. It's not sin in general. God expects us to sin. God knows that we're human. I'm not saying it's okay to sin. Not at all. But turning your back on God. So for them, it's not like they just completely deliberately turned their back on God, because they could have turned around and gone back to Egypt at any point. You know, any of them could have done that. They didn't have to stay with the group of Israelites. They could have turned around and gone back to Egypt and sold themselves back to slavery. So it wasn't like a blatant, just completely turn away and run away. But they turned their back on God on more than one occasion. They turned their back on God. They worshiped these idols. They went and created idols when they had this God that they've seen deliver them from many things. But for us, I think the application that we have is we don't have to leave the church to turn away from God. We don't have to not come to church, every week to turn our back on God. We can be here week after week and still kind of have our heart closed off to God.
history is turning their back on God. What they really did is they never said, forget you, God. What they did is embraced all these other gods and brought them in and made them on par with God. And it's the same thing we do, is we can still be Christian and still go to church and do all those things, but we turn around and bring in the world and all the different things that the world teaches, and just kind of embrace all that, and basically the greed and all the different things, and basically do the exact same thing that they did. And that's where they ran a lot of times, more than just throwing them out the window, because a lot of times they didn't do that. They just turned around and replaced him or added to.
Moses' life consisted of 340-year periods. This is in the last period of Moses' life, and they had the law of Moses, have no other God before you for about 40 years, and they were disobeying God, and he punished them to the tune of 24,000.
Anybody else have any thoughts before we close this morning?
I'll say one more thing. I think that's one of the problems we face today, big time in our country, is because we are being pulled farther and farther, generation by generation, to say it's okay. Sin is okay. You know, back, it was, adultery used to be unheard of, then it became okay, as long as it's between two consenting adults. Back in the 60s, and those who grew up, that part of that generation, the highest divorce rate ever in our history. Kids today are a result of more broken homes than ever before, and it's all considered okay. We see the struggles with homosexuality and all these things that just keep coming more and more and more as it starts pulling us farther and farther. And then if you try to do what these men that were crying here did and try to say what God says, then people turn around and come down on you, and people are unwilling to kind of be in that position, and it just keeps moving and moving. I just think this is one of the biggest struggles we have in our country right now. That's my personal opinion.
It's good to know we're not alone there, right?
It's true. Yeah, history repeats itself.
Something that's been around for thousands of years. Anybody have other comments before we close? Oh. John, here, close the word.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to study your word. Father, we thank you that you leave us examples showing how easy it is for your children to step away from you, to be enticed away from